Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the SpaceJam conversation on space law. So we have with us a panel of giants and stalwarts in their respective fields. So let me start with the doctor in the house. So Dr. Purvi joins us from ICFI Law School. Happens to be a very dear friend as well as one of the most qualified people in space law that I know. We also have Daniel from the Secure World Foundation. And of all the space lawyers that I've had the pleasure of meeting, I think Daniel qualifies as the man who's probably the coolest. And then we have, of course, Deepika from the world of commercial space. And I think she's one of the few people who has really seen the industry much more up close and personal than the rest of us. So I'm very excited to have this panel of experts on join us for today. So without further ado, let me start off with the very first conversation point, which has been doing the rounds. Richard Branson's journey into space. Right. So let me start with Dr. Purvi here. So Purvi, how do you see this from the point of view of space law? Do you think we have enough regulations to address space travel at the hands of entrepreneurs and private space enthusiasts? Or do you still think that there's some catching up to do? So what is your overall feeling with this new development that we saw in the last week?
In one word, volunty non fit injuria. You are volunteering yourself in a realm that's really not prepared legislatively or with a regulation with regards to whatever can happen out there in the cosmos. Why do I say that? Because envoys of mankind that we know astronauts are supposed to be. You cannot call a space tourism as envoy of mankind and throw around regulations from outer space treaty just because you felt like going for a moonwalk. That's how I believe. So definitely there are lots of regulatory gaps, I would say, that we need to put in place before we go for such expeditions.
Perfect. Volunteer non-fit injury. That's a very positive note to start off this conversation on space travel. Deepika, I want to jump to you because we did come up with a term that I think you, as a lawyer, would frequently have to address. In terms of just formulating a contract to take a space enthusiast into space, somebody who's not a person who would qualify as an astronaut, how do you think a commercial space operator will have to design their contracts to address the kind of legislative and a policy vacuum that Purvi just highlighted?
Sarvesh has finally unmuted me. I think from a commercial perspective, I would say they need to design contracts in a readable and simple format. So as Purvi said, people must know what they are signing up to. So it's not just the flight participants, but I would also think about the other actors who are involved in this whole activity, whether it's for insurance or other partners. I think a lot of clarity can and should be brought in terms of contracts. So that's the first point that they have to address. Apart from all the legal uncertainty and things, what exactly are people signing up to? That's that I would say is the most important.
Excellent. So let me just cut across to Daniel. So space has always been a traditional playing grounds for sovereign nations and countries, and now it's increasingly becoming a place where you assert your military prowess as well. In terms of just a security perspective, how do you think more and more civilians going into space is going to affect the way nations look at it as a theater of their own activities?
Probably one of the biggest concerns I would say at the moment that we have regarding the weaponization of outer space, well, not necessarily the militarization, because that already happened, but from a weaponization perspective, is the generation of additional debris. So more trash floating around, and everyone worries that this trash is going to hit something. I think one of the big calculations that governments are going to have to start making now is that something might have people on board, and debris can now potentially be the source of human fatalities, and especially as we're starting to see more and more of these tourists, space tourists going up. What I would like to see actually is not only that calculation happening from the government towards space tourists, but also the other way around, where space tourists start pressuring governments and say, hey, we're starting to develop this whole new industry. We want to start taking people into low Earth orbit. We're talking about, Richard Branson made it up to 80 kilometers. I think later today, the Blue Origin is going to make it up to 120 kilometers. So a little bit further beyond the Kármán line. But they can start looking to governments and saying, we can't do these industries if you're going to be destroying satellites, if you're going to be interfering with satellites and creating more dangers for us to take people up there. So liability in and of itself, I think, could be one source of pressure that space tourism could put on governments to try and make sure that we don't destabilize the low Earth orbit.
Interesting. So you see this as something that could positively impact the cause of better space situational awareness, or do you think it's going to only aggravate the problem?
It's tough to say because in this environment, it's the chicken and the egg. We do things in space, which generates debris, and the debris creates more problems. But we're pretty much hooked on carrying out space activities. What space tourism is doing is that it's just bringing space activities and the issues of space sustainability to the forefront. So yes, now we have Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos doing these kind of, if you want to call them stunts, you can. But they certainly are big publicity events that get a lot of attention. And now that we have millions and even potentially billions of people watching these journeys into outer space, when folks say yes, but by the way, this isn't going to be possible if we have all this trash flying around, now the public consciousness starts taking a better grasp of what the problem is. And hopefully they'll put pressure on leadership to start taking steps towards ensuring that we can maintain a stable orbital environment.
Perfect. So, you raise an interesting point about liability, right? So let me come back to Purvi again. How helpful or unhelpful is the liability convention? Is that something that could address the legal risks around space travel, or are we still at a situation where we think that it requires certain tweaking, or do we need something new altogether?
Ashok, space debris being the topic that I love the most. My thesis is on debris and the need for international legal framework and to make it binding, which is another huge discussion in itself, because the world is not ready for a binding agreement as of now. But then eventually, as an academician, so to say, and not from the industry, how long will you evade it is the question here. Therefore, the liability convention, of course, has a lot of anomalies and a lot of gaps in terms of, putting the pieces together. So I believe rather than rehauling the whole thing and getting a new act, it's better that they start from fixing in the liability convention. For example, small little definitions like, what do you understand by potential harm? What do you understand by the word harm itself? Or a definition like when you say fault-based liability or vicarious liability in space, how do you define it? The liability convention should be exhaustive enough to rewrite itself and pin those, small little definitions. And so to say, the irony of the situation is the contemporary topic of debris that so many people like me fall in love with space and do their PhDs. The word debris itself doesn't have a definition. So to say, it's exhaustively spoken about. It's such a contemporary issue, but the world is not congregated enough to come to a point where they give it a proper definition under which you can say, okay, these cataloged pieces are debris, and if they hit, then this amounts to this liability. So the first and fulcrum point here is giving definitional meanings to all these words. Because eventually countries know, and we've seen it as a practice, that they evade the actions that they do. So if you have a straight-jacketed, definitions in place, they can be held liable. So that's where the liability convention has to address itself. So to begin with, and then we need to talk about what should be the sentencing guideline, or what should be the liability that it brings forth. Is it in terms of pecuniary issue? Is it in terms of just banning them from sending any satellite for next 2 years, 3 years? Some kind of suspension from the, or is there any kind of orbital maintenance fund that we need to have at the United Nations level, where such organizations who are sending their satellites on a day-to-day basis and generating heaps of money, at least there is something to maintain, like Daniel said, sustainability of space. And it's at stake, we all know. Because the LEO and the GEO are such small little orbits that their sustainability is so much at stake, there is something that needs to be done. And now another point that Daniel raised here was the concept of private entities when they want to send their something like space tourism, let's say. So a question here is ADR possible enough, or does it still have a host of regulatory issues with regards to economic, with regards to military? So ADR in itself is a huge issue that we need to talk about. So
Right.
yes,
Right.
fixing the liability issue here, but not just overhauling it, just making definitional changes first. Baby steps.
Got it. So I actually had a question for Deepika, but I think there's some technical glitches. I'm not able to see her, so we'll just wait for her to come back. But Daniel, Purvi raised a very important point about alternate dispute resolution itself being a different ball game, right? Now, what we have seen from history is that when you don't have civilized means of dispute resolution, there's usually escalation to a military kind of an approach, right? So, from your perspective, how do you see the evolution of a good dispute resolution mechanism as a way of strengthening, security interests in space?
So one of the trends that we're also seeing in space at the moment is that space is not special anymore. We are a lot more folks are starting to take the approach that, look, we're doing all the normal things that we do down here on Earth. We're just moving them into a much higher environment.
True.
So it doesn't necessarily have to belong to this very special, very mythical legal regime that doesn't even exist at the moment. We have had some examples of damage done to other objects. We had a Russian or a Soviet spacecraft that crashed into Canada once, and there was radioactive material spread over many, many kilometers, and the Russian government ultimately had to come in and pay for it. And everything that was done around that particular incident was all done through internal negotiations. Again, we also had an incident where there was an Intelsat satellite that collided with an old Cosmos satellite. How was that dealt with? It was all dealt with internally, in large part because the launching state and the state at fault happened to be the same ones for on both sides. But what we see there is that we just haven't had that many moments or that many instances where we had to test dispute resolution in outer space. Maybe a few others that we can point to relating to interference. But as these incidents start becoming more and more common, we're working out the kinks, figuring out what are the instruments and what are the tools that we need to make sure that people can come to reasonable reasonable resolutions. Now that, I think, can work really well, especially when we're talking about between commercial actors, when we're talking about people who are possibly within the same legal jurisdiction, people who come from the same legal backgrounds. What happens when we start talking about government to government? What happens when we start talking about military to military? That's where I think we have there is the threat that escalation can happen, that there is an incident in space, let's say there's a close proximity operation that goes wrong and something gets damaged, or that somebody mistakes that close proximity operation for a hostile intention. There we could potentially see things escalating, and not just in space, but also down here on Earth. Many governments have already said, just because you attack us in space does not mean that we're necessarily going to respond in space. Maybe we'll respond in cyber. Maybe we'll respond on the ground. It could be any number of things, but all of these things will lead to hostile actions, and we don't want to get to that point. So the work at the United Nations right now, and amongst a lot of the multilateral intergovernmental organizations, is what are the guardrails that we can put in place to make sure that if dispute resolution fails, we're not going to go towards an escalatory situation where we might actually start pulling space lasers out, or shooting people's satellites down and creating a lot of debris.
Perfect. So, Deepika, I'll come to you next. Now, we've understood that the liability convention is a good start, but it has some catching up to do. We also understand what are the risks associated with dispute resolution not really working out, right? And we're looking at a situation where you have to address what next, right? Now, if I come to you as a person who has the money and who wants to fly to space, right? And I know a lot of people want me to go to space as well. If I come to you and I pose a query that if I go to space, what kind of, does international law recognize me as somebody who can be granted the benefits of the rescue agreement and the OSD? Or will international law just leave me high and dry and say, hey, you made the mistake of going to space, now you pay the price, right? So what would your opinion be to me?
Just as any lawyer would say, we'd start with it depends. And then we'd have to look into, maybe to set the scene a bit for the uninitiated. So you have the Outer Space Treaty, you have the Liability Convention, which essentially are then flown down into national legislations by the different states. And it's up to the national legislation to define how they're going to authorize your launch and what sort of rights are given for these, let's say, spaceflight participants. And although liability convention per se is not directly flown down to them, it's still a matter between the states. You can imagine these contracts that that you as a flight participant have to sign, having several clauses about liability. What sort of indemnification do you have? What sort of insurance requirements you have, and so on. This is also the reason why I said, okay, if a person is signing up to this, they should know exactly what they're signing up for. So I would say the Outer Space Treaty, I think it's wrong to say it doesn't cover any of these people. It does in the end, but it depends on where people draw their references from and how well and efficiently they implement these provisions.
Okay, so here's a quick follow-up question for you. From the point of view of a person like me signing a contract to be taken into space and back, should I be seen in the same light as a subject for the purpose of data privacy regulations under the GDPR? Or should I be treated as somebody who is reasonably well informed, who is very intelligent and articulate, is able to understand what he's signing? So therefore, the contract language need not be infantilized for my benefit. So what standard should apply to decide whether or not I participated with free consent and I knew what I was getting into? Where do you think we should draw a reference from?
Yeah, I'm worried that you use the word infantilization for contracts. I would say, okay, think about the contract as a user interface. So as long as the person who's signing it can understand it, despite all the legalese or pictures, whatever the contract contains, I think then it's fine. I cannot imagine a person saying, okay, this is great, I'm just going to sit on top of a rocket and everything's going to be fine. Clearly, the law will not accept that. I mean, that's just ignorance. But I think when people look into some contracts, you don't want to be burdened with 100 pages of things talking about liability. They just want to know, okay, what happens if this goes wrong? What is the consequence? What relief will me or my family get? What sort of recourse do I have against the company that's taking me to space? So I think as long as you're aware of that, that should be fine.
Okay, last question before I move on to Purvi. Inter-party waivers, which are a common feature of launch agreements, do you think that should be equally a feature for human travelers into space?
Ashok, your voice broke up. Could you please repeat that again?
Sorry, am I audible now? Okay, so inter-party waivers, which are a typical feature of most launch services contracts, should that be replicated even for those kind of launch missions taking human travelers into space? Or do we regulate and say inter-party waivers cannot be a feature of these kind of launch agreements?
Depends what these waivers include. So I can imagine if it is to do with safety of the passenger, those safety mechanisms would not be part of the waiver. Just as we would say for any airline passenger ticket that we have, there is a certain amount of passenger safety which is undeniable. The company just has to take responsibility for it. But I think if you are talking about different kinds of accidents, you could also build in different types of liabilities for that. For now, the only thing that I can think about is drawing examples from our airline terms and conditions to see if that's something that we can live with also for space. The minute we travel beyond space, let's say it becomes more of an orbital feature, you stay there, then you would have to think about a few other rights and what that means for liability. Do you guarantee spaceflight participants enough oxygen, food, and water? I mean, yeah, those are things that you need to address as well.
Okay, cool. Let me come back to Purvi here. I think we spoke about space debris, right? And the obvious next question is, where do we stand in terms of regulation on space debris? And I would like to examine two angles. One is India domestically, how equipped are we to address space debris, and globally, where do we stand, and how far away are we from regulating Bisleri bottles in space, right?
So if you ask me a very straight answer and a very crisp answer, it'll be it's half baked yet. Why do I say so? Because the world came together. We put so much of effort. All the nations congregated together to give ourselves guidelines on debris mitigation in 2007. But then they had no fangs of enforceability. They are just loose, guidelines out there, which are great. At least that's the first great step forward. But then what is the point when an accident happens and you're not able to bring that, guideline from your arsenal, and you're not able to put it to use and use it like an arrow and get the result? So the first and foremost thing that the world needs to do right now is negotiate further and bring forth a charter where we have a proper set of binding regulation on debris. Because if you see, after post COVID, before COVID things were great, post COVID, knowingly unknowingly, we are thrice dependent on space for every kind of satellite that we launch there. And eventually it's a natural resource, and its sustainability is at stake, which has been established over and over by not just academia but also scientifically, so to say. So the amount of load you're putting on that small little orbit without regulating it, and without putting any repercussions of the activity that is happening there. So I think first and foremostly, IADC should either be converted into a binding form, or if they want to come together again and discuss, there should be a charter where a binding agreement is there on debris. Because they say it's a legal problem. No, it's not just a legal problem, it's an economic problem. It's a multidisciplinary problem, so to say. Yes, Daniel.
If I can follow up on that, actually.
Yes.
And I totally agree with you that it is multidisciplinary.
Yes.
I firmly believe that the liability convention is it's the teeth of outer space law, but we never use it. We've never really had an occasion to show that actually somebody can be held responsible economically, financially, for an accident, assuming that we can even figure out how we're going to determine fault. One of the things one of the possible solutions that I think could really help to start bringing greater, putting more responsibility on actors for their actions is actually, I'm very happy to see so much improvement in the space situational awareness domain, because now we're going to be able to tell where much smaller debris, where it's going, and if it hits something, it's going to be the odds of being able to determine where that piece of debris came from and who was responsible for it will be much higher. So maybe in the future, as we start getting better situational awareness and a better understanding of where the debris is going, we'll be able to track this stuff and say, yeah, you see that hole that I have in my Canada arm? That piece of debris came from this thing that you did 10 years ago, and we've been tracking it the whole time and telling you need to move it out of, do something about these clouds of debris. So now you've hit something, now we're going to have to talk about it. And there's evidence.
Perfect. So I have a really outlandish question to ask you, Daniel, at this point of time, since you are the security expert in this panel. Here's a hypothetical scenario. A person claims to be a space tourist, goes into space, decides to do a spacewalk, but turns out he happens to be a spy who's taking a closer look at a Russian satellite. Right. So and Russian cosmonaut happens to catch him and put him in a space station they're running. Right. So how do you think international law will address this problem of espionage?
Well, right now, as far as outer space law goes, espionage is not illegal. If somebody has a satellite out there, particularly like a military satellite, I don't need to go into space to look at it. I can go get a really fancy telescope and look at it. This is one of the problems we often have with the American spy satellites. The DoD doesn't want to admit that their satellites are out there, and yet everyone is standing around going, look, I can see it. And because it's not on the catalog, I know it's one of your spy satellites. The deduction is that simple. So perhaps from an espionage perspective, we wouldn't say that that there would be a heavy consequence, or maybe politically or diplomatically, there would be an incident. But let's say said spy interferes with a Russian spy satellite and actually degrades the satellite's ability to do whatever it's doing. Now, the question is, was that hostile? Was that a hostile action? Is that something that I can defend myself over? Is that something that I can call out repercussions? Never mind the fact that we just arrested the individual, but who authorized the individual? Who sent the individual? Now do I have sufficient ground to respond? This is an area that it's not terribly clear in international law. We often talk about how there are gaps in space law. We don't necessarily, or we don't have all the tools to prevent an arms race in space. I would argue that we have a lot of tools, we just don't know how to use them in space. So the Geneva Convention applies to outer space, Article 2.4, no threat or use of force against an object in outer space. Good luck telling me what the threat or use of force against the satellite is. There's no consensus. So that's one of the areas where we see, again, the potential for escalation. Maybe, whoever sent this spy to go and interfere with the Russian satellite, maybe to them, they weren't doing anything hostile, but maybe the Russians take it as hostile, and therefore they end up taking action that you might call a proportionate response. What is it? What is a proportionate response against a satellite, against a spy satellite even? We don't know. So we hope that the United Nations in the next couple of months and potentially years might actually be able to elaborate that so that there is some consensus and everyone can just say, look, if you jam my spy satellite or my early warning missile or my early warning detection satellite that is there to monitor launches from North Korea, if you interfere with one of those satellites, I'm assuming that you're attacking me and I will respond. And that's, it's just something that we haven't clarified. Perfect.
All right. So Deepika, coming to you, I know you one of the, so for the uninitiated, Deepika also has an excellent background in intellectual property. So this is my next question to you. If tomorrow I were to float a business for research and development in space, because space is full of mysterious stuff waiting to be discovered, right? What would you advise me in terms of how I can, catalog and protect the IP that I might generate studying the force, for example?
Your company is based on Earth?
Well, yes, it is. And what if it is not?
I walked into that one. Well, okay, I think at least with space, IP is a lot simpler compared to the other industries. Because of the way we developed, because it was predominantly governments and or institutions working with space, they didn't explore different options with the IP protection. So if you talk to most of the engineers, they would be like, well, okay, this is patented, this is not patented, nobody needs to know about this, that's it. What people tend to forget is know-how and other just knowledge in their heads. That's also IP. They're not registered, but that's IP. And what's tricky when you do a lot of collaborations, or if you're doing studies where you get public funding and so on, there's almost always a clause that either says you need to put this research out in public, or you need to be able to share this with a bunch of others. And if you are a small company or a startup, this can be scary, because the only thing that keeps you afloat is this core knowledge that you have. So I think at least with this hypothetical company and the people, they should be aware of what is core for the business. What is going to bring you the customers, what is going to bring you the money, and so on. And how you register it, how you deal with the IP. Again, there are a lot of creative options. In my company, for example, in some cases, it's okay to just black box it. So don't talk about things, don't share documents that others have no need to know. And I understand this is extremely hard for engineers, because they want to share their amazing baby with the whole world. So if you are an engineer watching this, a lot of things that you do have value. So you have to be very conscious about how important the knowledge that you have in your head is. You need to be able to flag things at the right moment if it needs to be registered, and so on.
Okay, so a quick follow-up question, which is also equally outlandish. In the course of my work in space, I discovered a way of creating and sustaining a wormhole for space travel, right? And now I want to assert a monopoly on who enters that wormhole and who doesn't. Right? So what would your recommendation be? Is there a framework that will help me monopolize my wormhole, or is that a little bit where I have to share it with the entire world out there?
This is the great example for when you use a black box. Don't talk about it. Have a secret contract with people who you want to license to enter the wormhole, and you make your whole life easy. There's no need to engage a bunch of lawyers. So this is what you need to do.
Okay, excellent. So Purvi, let me just come to you. I mean, the reason why I brought up the subject of a wormhole and gateway into space, and I know Deepika is also a fan of The Expanse. So we are looking at all of this potentially to mine resources in space and bring it back to Earth, right? To impact our economies.
Right.
Just in terms of international regulations, what according to you is a right way of balancing, on one hand, the need to economically leverage space, but at the same time ensure that it does not have a disruptive effect on life on Earth, right? So your thoughts on space mining and how we could effectively address it?
Well, if you ask me, earlier we had established a rule of non-appropriation, and the world walked past it and reached a place where we believe in appropriation now. And we have found different ways to give legality to this thought and give it sanctity by under the Outer Space Treaty. Like, it's okay to appropriate. But the whole question boils down to the one notion that we all believe, that it's common heritage of mankind and it belongs to everyone. So the question here is fair allocation of resources. So if you ask me in terms of academia, I would say saying that a resource is different from a celestial body, it's just a ram jam of throwing it around. They both are the same, because eventually that resource is on that celestial body in the outer space. So eventually the whole body is outside and you are appropriating it. Now the question is, when you sever it from the body of that celestial, let's say you're bringing a rock from the moon, you're severing it off from the celestial. So eventually that rock, no matter what, belongs to everyone, even if it is America or India or any nation that appropriates it. So the whole question here is, how do we allocate the resources? Because if you ask my personal opinion, there will be a time in future when we are knowingly or unknowingly dependent on the resources for water, for coal, for whatever the universe has bestowed upon us that we can bring forth down here. So the question here is not legality alone, it's a question of management as well. How does United Nations gear itself for 25 or 50 years from now, where the resources are brought and it just does not fall under the kitty of the developed ones or under the kitty of spacefaring nations? A nation like Utopia, a nation like Zambia, a nation which does not have the resources to even send a satellite up there, it belongs equally to them. So the allocation of resources and a charter under the United Nations which envisions it now 50 years ago is
Perfect.
what I believe.
Perfect.
Because eventually, we believe it or not, we are in a realm where no matter what you dream becomes a reality tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Walking on the moon, staying on the moon, colonizing the moon was something people would laugh at and write in romanticism. But we are making it true. So we are in a business of making dreams come true. So the legality has to be now.
Absolutely. I think that's something that I can quote you on. We're in the business of making dreams come true. So Daniel, I know this is a subject that you have some level of connection with. So the scenario that I have for you is that I'm undertaking a mining activity on an asteroid that's entered my solar system. And in the course of that activity, I also discover an artifact that could belong to an alien civilization. Right. So what do we do with this? Right. Do I have to surrender this to the United Nations, or do I get to keep it in my conference room and say, look what I found?
So you and I talked quite a lot about this when I was doing my my master's in law at Georgetown, and this was ultimately the thesis of my paper. You know, what happens when you discover, or if you have these astronauts who are out, or explorers, or someone who's doing mining, and they discover either an artifact or potentially a new type of mineral. What if you discover something that we just don't have here on Earth? I mean, we've done plenty of studies, and I think scientists have more or less agreed that the universe is made up of the same stuff all over the place. But you never know if you're going to come across something new. Or what if you come across a microbe? What if you come across, not necessarily like an extraterrestrial in the sense of like ET or Baby Yoda or something like that, but you come across, some type of bacteria that's growing elsewhere. According to the Outer Space Treaty, these types of findings are scientific in nature. They do belong to everyone. It's not something that you're actually, at least under the Outer Space Treaty, that's not something that you're supposed to keep to yourself. That's something that you should be able to share. Now, that being said, being in the business of making dreams come true also means that we have to find lots of money to make dreams come true. And that means making it profitable for companies to at least be able to do things, making it worthwhile for folks to go off planet, to go in search of these different riches, which supposedly are out there. So we do at least need to respect the fact that there is going to be a lot of effort. There's going to be a lot of work and a lot of investment that goes into this. So how do we balance those, the need for profit? Like, as dirty a word as it is, that is really what's driving all these amazing advancements that we've been seeing coming out of the commercial sector for the last 2 decades. It's the search for profit. How do we balance that with our higher aspirations and our ethics and our morals and our, this ideal that we have that, as you said, space belongs to everyone. The knowledge that is out there shouldn't be hoarded. Where's the balance? Like, where do we find that middle ground? It's tricky. We're going to have to come to an agreement on some of these things and actually make some efforts. But, for example, for me, I would say, if a company discovers a new element or something biological or even an artifact of an ancient civilization, a la The Expanse, yeah, that's not yours. That is something that absolutely has to be shared with the rest of the world. However, let's say you're up in space and you find a new way to meld 2 materials that you couldn't do on Earth, and now you've created this whole new thing. Well, that's your work, your effort, you put it all in there. I think now, even because you're not discovering something new and necessarily taking the knowledge that already exists out there, but actually investing your own work and having a new product, I think you can make an argument that that's your product. What's this company, NewSpace, which is now Redwire? That's a great example of someone who they figured out how to use materials that we all have. They made something new, which was fiber optic cables and microgravity that are extremely efficient. That's a new product that you can't find here on Earth, but they worked at it, they studied it, they generated it, and they printed it, and now I think they should be able to sell it and make a profit from it. And hopefully we'll all profit from that.
Perfect. So, Devika, one more outlandish question coming your way. The ethics of terraformation from an environmental law perspective, right? If I want to convert a Mars into an Earth, do you think it somewhere offends the sensibilities of environmental law, which is all about preserving the state of environment as is? Or do you think environmental law must always be Earth-centric and Earth-focused?
This is a tough one. Several things. I think if we are going to take the path where we think, okay, we are the only intelligent beings in this universe, space is ours to explore and to use. It wouldn't be wrong to take into account environmental considerations and law along with that in how we assess these things. I think what's more important is how we compartmentalize different parts of space and what sort of laws apply to them. I read an interesting paper where they said, well, the orbital resources, those can be considered global commons. From a US perspective, the moon, okay, that's probably not a global common, and so on. And I think if we do such compartmentalization for convenience instead of being very conscious about it, then it gets very tricky how we would address sustainability. We aren't really doing a great job with how we protect the environment on Earth. So for me personally, I would say we must take these laws. And another point, I was thinking about this when Puri was talking about space resources as well. The thing that you hear often is when people say, we are going to get resources out of the moon, they say, it's just like taking fish out of the high seas. But little do these people follow, or maybe they conveniently forget that the UN is also working on declarations and things on how to protect certain sites, how to avoid overfishing. So I think these are trends that we definitely need to take into space exploration. If we want to be better people, to not repeat the mistakes, I think it would be a good way to have a lessons learned and then move forward with that.
See, that wasn't a very tough question after all.
I would add on to Deepika and say in conformity. Absolutely. I think space is another golden chance for humanity to be better than we have been with Earth. So if we look at it as a natural resource as valuable and as exquisite as Earth, this is our golden chance to be better humans. And when we say we are sending space tourism out there, of course, they are not astronauts. They are very different from astronauts. They are people who aspire to go and see the moon and travel and come back. So we add humanitarian laws to them. Because if we do not, we have to somewhere protect them by the law. So insurance law plays its part. Humanitarian law equally plays its part, because eventually it's humanity out there. They are our representatives, if not envoys of mankind. At the same place, I would also say, like Deepika said, when you are treating space as a pristine, the way you keep it clean and you keep it just ready for the next generation to be handed over, there needs to be protocols and inspirations that we can draw from the environmental law, from the way things are happening globally in that realm or sector. And like she said, It's not, absolutely not, as going for a fishing and bringing it out there. And like I said before as well, it's you're stealing, or if I don't use the word stealing, you're taking it, appropriating it from a place that belongs to everyone, even to the have-nots of the world, who have never set their foot or who will never set their foot on space because of their economic challenges. So keeping everyone's interest in the way we need to preserve it, along with maintaining that environment, it's very, very important.
Absolutely. So we are running a little short of time, so let me just ask my last outlandish question for the day, and we'll take questions from the audience after that. So we are now talking of a time when we have discovered an alien world with an intelligent civilization. We need to now start worrying about who goes and interacts with them on our behalf, and what should be the do's and don'ts that these people must undertake or must commit to, right? So quick, one regulation that each of you would recommend for this potential contact with an intelligent civilization, right? So let me start with Dr. Purvi.
Can you please repeat the question?
So
it was damn outlandish.
yeah. So we have to pick a team that's we have to regulate contact with an alien civilization, right?
Okay.
So a quick one regulation that you would want to put in place to make sure that we don't do what Christopher Columbus did with the indigenous American population, right? So something on those lines. So quick one regulation that each of you would like to impose on this team.
The first thing I would do is switch on to the Outer Space Treaty and treat him like, an alien, and then go about it, because Outer Space Treaty has been very clear in terms of how the aliens or the natives of the Earth need to regulate themselves. So that's where I would start.
Perfect. Daniel, on to you.
Not engage. That's the one directive. One, if we do find other primitive life forms that are less sophisticated than us, well, we all know that it didn't work out so well the last time. So leave them alone. Two, I agree with Stephen Hawking, who said, if we ever come into contact with intelligent beings from another planet, they're probably going to be a lot more sophisticated than we are. And they will probably look at us about the same way that we look at a pile of ants somewhere in the middle of the forest. And if lessons learned, like how well have we done when we've come into contact with new species? It's not great. So yeah, my one directive would be, do not engage, hide.
Yeah. Deepika, what would you say?
One was super easy. So I would say suppress the urge to speak English slowly, hoping that the aliens will understand you then.
Okay. All right, perfect. But it brings me to the last question for the day, right? So clearly with private space tourists going into space, I think eventually we are going to ask ourselves this question: should we put a certain outer limit beyond which they are not allowed to travel? Right. So quick 30 seconds from all of you, right? Should Jeff Bezos be allowed to make contact with an alien civilization? So that's the question, right? So should we say, okay, you can travel to the moon, but not beyond, right? Do we have to look at a regulation to that effect? 30 seconds each of you. Let's start with Dr. Purvi.
Absolutely not. No regulations, because we say space is vast. So as long as wherever his fuel ends, he's happy to go, travel and tell us all the stories.
I think he's frozen.
Yeah.
Well, I'll keep going with that question as well. Every space activity has to get a license and has to be regulated in and of itself. A lot of these experimental activities, especially where industry is going really far out, they require very special licenses to do some of the things they want to do anyway. So I think we can probably regulate that on a case-by-case basis.
Perfect. Okay, so sorry, I got logged out in between. Deepika, have you already given your comments?
No, I will just say what Daniel said, because if not, it would just be another frontier that needs to be breached anyway. So why bother?
Depends.
It depends.
Okay, all right. So I think with that, we have come to the point where I stop asking my silly questions. Now we open it up to the audience to hopefully ask the more sensible questions for the day. So yes, we can start taking questions from the audience. So my request is that why don't you guys enter your question into the chat window, then I will take it to the panel in front of us.
Ashok, there are 3 questions in the Q&A box.
Okay, sorry,
You can see it.
Okay,
would be
so
able
how
to
do I
see.
access the Q&A box? Sorry, it's a very dumb question to ask, but
Okay, let me read it
Next
out
to the 3 dots that you see.
below the chat. So there are 3
okay,
questions.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so the first question is, this is something that I think is equally applicable to all 3 of you. How did you get interested in space law? How much of STEM training did you need? Okay, I will not answer this question. This is a little tricky for me, but the 3 of you can please take this forward.
Let's start with Daniel.
Yeah.
I like to think of myself as an explorer. I love the frontier, but unfortunately, I was never going to become an explorer and I was never going to become an engineer. So I just found the last frontier of law that I could find. I always like to confess, I suppose, that it was the only area of law that was big enough for my ego, I suppose, for my vanity. But also it's so new. There's just so much room for creativity and imagination. You know, the outer space law is very broad and very general, and there were so many activities when I first started looking at space law that the possibilities just seemed endless. So in a way, I think like the inner artist in me came out and said, like, yeah, this is a place where you can still make an impact. There's a big canvas that just has barely been touched. So it's fascinating.
So for me, it was during my LLM days at Nalsar when every single act that I had needed an amendment. So I was wondering, is there an act which is just begun and it needs not much amendments, but it's just nascent and it'll grow with time? And then in Dr. Balakista's office, I found out about, there is a law out there on space, and it was so fascinating as a student and exploring a new branch of law, which is not just nascent, but scientific as well. So that's where the first love for space law began.
For me, I think it was also similar to what Purvi and Daniel said. It was an accidental choice, but I think why I got hooked to space law was because one, I'm a science fiction fan, so it's great to have the opportunity to work with things that are were at one point considered science fiction as well. And from a legal side, I think it's really fulfilling to live at a time where you're part of a process, where you create new things, where you see things happening around you. So it's great to be a witness or a participant, depending on what the topic is.
So I think I'll answer the STEM question myself. I think the only STEM education I've had is Star Wars, Star Trek, and Isaac Asimov. So I think I'll conclude on that question. Okay, so the next question is, this is interesting. If I want to enforce privacy on my piece of land from Earth observation satellites, is that even possible? So let me, I see Daniel furiously shaking his head, but let me start with Deepika and I'll come to Daniel after that.
I would say it would be nice to mask your property from the visibility, but I don't think there's an enforceable right where you can't be observed. So maybe we should think about a right to be observed or a right to be unobserved under human rights.
I'm wondering if the author of the question wants to grow marijuana on his field or something. I mean, so anyway, Daniel.
So there are actually some UN resolutions towards this, and very early on they came out with the principles on remote observation. Now, a big reason why states first started talking about this was because the Soviets and the Americans weren't totally sure whether they agreed or whether they wanted to be able to spy on one another, in particular to be able to monitor their nuclear forces and the buildup of their arsenals. So they decided, okay, we're going to go ahead and say that you can take whatever pictures you want of the Earth, precisely so that the Americans and the Soviets can have this confidence that whatever disarmament and arms control agreements they're coming to at the time, that they would have national technical means of verification to say, yes, the Soviets are, they have agreed that they are going to keep their forces under this level, and they're only going to put forces in these areas where you can monitor it, we can take pictures of it, we can see it from space. We're not violating airspace in this case, and we can at least have some confidence that the obligations are being followed. Now, the new wrinkle in that debate is the data. So back then, it was only the Americans and the Soviets, and who were going back to their militaries and looking at the photos. But now we're selling it, we're sharing it. There are private companies who are out there who are taking pictures of the entire planet in a day. So Planet Labs, for example, they take one picture of the entire planet every single day. Countries can regulate the way that the data is sold within their borders. But outside of your borders, it's fair game. You can see it from wherever. And the same rules apply as for satellites, All I need to do is just get a fancy telescope, point it up, and I can see the satellite. Likewise, I can put a nice camera on a satellite, chuck it up, and I can start taking pictures of things. Now, whether or not I can do anything with the data afterwards, that's where I think the regulatory bodies can start coming in and having some control.
Perfect. So I think this next question could be very relevant for Dr. Purvi. The question is, let me paraphrase and kind of word it differently. Do we have enough international law regulating space activities? Do we need more or do we need less?
We just need to amend them. Having a lot of bundle of laws and not applying them, like Daniel said, we already have what we need. We just need to reframe them in the light of events that's happening right now. For example, the space tourism. So liability convention or registration convention. In terms of debris, registration convention and liability convention are two different isolated bodies. They need to be congregated. So I would say academia standpoint, we have good amount of law. All we need is re-refinement and blending them together, congregating them together. That's what we need.
Perfect. All right. So I don't see any other audience questions. Let me, I think we are also out of time. So it's PM. So the parting note that I would request all of you, if there is somebody out there who is looking at space as a career option, even from the point of view of law, what is the one piece of advice that you will give to that person out there? Right. So let me start with Dr. Purvi and then I'll go to the others.
If a person walks in the space, just like a spacewalk, I would say, watch out, have your insurance in place, make your family rich.
That's a very optimistic tone. I like that. Daniel, your advice to a young man or woman looking to get into space law?
Going to be unpleasant. It's not going to be fun. You are going to cry a lot, and you're going to. It's hard to get into this business. Like it's almost like a waiting game, but it's worth it. It is absolutely worth it. Do internships, do networking, do what you can, but more than anything, just when it gets hard, recognize that that is how it's supposed to be, and eventually the discomfort will go away, and then you'll make it.
Deepika, coming to you, and I know you have walked that journey, so I think your inputs are very relevant here.
A few things. So you don't have to be a space buff to enter into space law. It helps, but you don't necessarily have to be one. I think you should also come in with a very open mindset that you should be able to learn from all sorts of people around you. Maybe also to the question about STEM knowledge, it's not necessary that you need to have STEM knowledge, but you should be open to learning about it and understanding it in order for you to be a better space lawyer. So those would be my two pieces of advice.
Perfect. So I think with that, we have come to the end of the session. So, I mean, with a panel of this quality, I think the real challenge is for somebody like me to ask the right kind of questions. I know we have only touched upon maybe a 10% of all that these people have to offer in terms of their knowledge. But I invite all of you to follow them on Twitter, keep abreast of the literature that they publish, because these are the people who are actually doing it every day, right? So these are actual space law practitioners, and I'm so glad that we were able to have this 1 hour with them to get their inputs on a variety of topics, some serious and some really outlandish. So on behalf of SatSure, thank you all three of you for taking the time and being with us here today. It really means a lot. And I'm sure you can expect a good amount of follow-up questions from a lot of people who are now going to start following you. So thank you again, and I think that brings us to the end of the session today. Thank you.